neurosurgical grand rounds where unusual cases were presented and discussed by all the surgeons of the hospital were normally scheduled for Thursdays at 9. Special rounds were hardly ever called. It was too difficult for the staff to get together. But now the amphitheater was packed, tier after tier of white jackets and pale faces staring down at Ellis, who pushed his glasses up on his nose and said, "As many of you know, tomorrow morning, Neuropsychiatric Research Unit will perform a limbic pacing procedure, what we call a stage 3 on a human patient." There was no sound, no movement from the audience. Janet Ross stood in the corner of the amphitheater near the doors and watched. She found it odd that there should be so little reaction, but then it was hardly a surprise. Everyone in the hospital knew that the NPS had been waiting for a good stage 3 subject. "I must ask you," Ellis said, "to restrain your questions when the patient is introduced. He is a sensitive man and his disturbance is quite severe. We thought you should have the psychiatric background before we bring him in. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Ross, will give you a summary." Ellis nodded to Ross. She came forward to the center of the room. She stared up at the steeply banked rows of faces and felt a momentary hesitation. Janet Ross was tall and exceptionally good-looking, in a lean, tanned, dark blonde way. She herself felt she was too bony and angular, and she often wished she were more softly feminine. But she knew her appearance was striking, and at 30, after more than a decade of training in a predominantly masculine profession, she had learned to use it. She clasped her hands behind her back, took a breath, and launched into the summary, delivering it in a rapid, stylized method that was standard for grand rounds. "Harold Franklin Benson," she said, "is a 34-year-old divorced computer scientist who was healthy until 2 years ago, when he was involved in an automobile accident in the Santa Monica Freeway. Following the accident, he was unconscious for an unknown period of time. He was taken to a local hospital for overnight observation and discharged the next day in good health. He was fine for 6 months until he began to experience what he called blackouts." The audience was silent, faces staring down at her, listening. These blackouts lasted several minutes and occurred about once a month. They were often preceded by the sensation of peculiar, unpleasant odors. The blackouts frequently occurred after drinking alcohol. The patient consulted his local physician, who told him he was working too hard and recommended he reduce his alcohol intake. Benson did this, and the blackouts continued. 1 year ago, a year after the accident, he realized that the blackouts were becoming more frequent and lasting longer. He often regained consciousness to find himself in unfamiliar surroundings. On several occasions, he had cuts and bruises or torn clothing, which suggested that he had been fighting. However, he never remembered what occurred during the blackout periods. Heads in the audience nodded. They understood what she was telling them. It was a straightforward history for a temporal lobe epileptic. The hard part was coming. The patient's friends, she continued, told him that he was acting differently, but he discounted their opinion. Gradually, he had lost contact with most of his former friends. Around this time, 1 year ago, he made what he called a monumental discovery in his work. Benson is a computer scientist, specializing in artificial life, or machine intelligence. In the course of this work, he says he discovered that machines were competing with human beings, and that ultimately machines would take over the world. Now, there was whispers in the audience. This interested them, particularly the psychiatrist. She could see her old teacher, Manson, sitting in the top row, holding his head in his hands. Manson knew. Benson communicated his discovery to his remaining friends. They suggested that he see a psychiatrist, which angered him. In the last year, he has become increasingly certain that machines are conspiring to take over the world. Then, 6 months ago, the patient was arrested by police on suspicion of beating up an airplane mechanic. Positive identification could not be made, and charges were dropped. But the episode unnerved Benson and led him to seek psychiatric help. He had a vague suspicion that somehow he had been the man who had beaten the mechanic to a bloody pulp. That was unthinkable to him, but the nagging suspicion remained. He was referred to the university hospital. in the Neuropsychiatric Research Unit 4 months ago. In November 1970, on the basis of his history, head injury, episodic violence, preceded by strange smells, he was considered a probable psychomotor epileptic. As you know, the NPS now accepts only patients with organically treatable behavioral disturbances. A neurosurgical examination was fully normal. An electroencephalogram was fully normal. Brain wave activity showed no pathology. It was repeated after alcohol ingestion, and an abnormal tracing was obtained. The EEG showed seizure activity in the right temporal lobe of the brain. Benson was therefore considered a stage 1 patient. Firm diagnosis of psychomotor epilepsy. She paused to get her breath and let the audience absorb what she had told them. The patient is an intelligent man, she said, and his illness was explained to him. He was told he had injured his brain in the automobile accident, and as a result had a form of epilepsy that produced thought seizures, seizures of the mind, not the body, leading to violent acts. He was told that the disease was common and could be controlled. He was started on a series of drug trials. 3 months ago, Benson was arrested on charges of assault and battery. The victim was a 24-year-old topless dancer who later dropped charges. The hospital intervened slightly on his behalf. 1 month ago, drug trials of Marlodone, Pamino, Benzodone, and Trimaline were concluded. Benson showed no improvement on any drug or combination of drugs. He was therefore stage 2 drug-resistant psychomotor epilepsy, and he was scheduled for a 3-stage surgical procedure, which we will discuss today. She paused. Before I bring him in, she said, I think I should add that yesterday afternoon he attacked a gas station attendant and beat the man rather badly. His operation is scheduled for tomorrow, and we have persuaded the police to release him in our custody. But he is still technically awaiting arraignment on charges of assault and battery. The room was silent. She paused for a moment, then went to bring in Benson. Benson was just outside the doors to the amphitheater, sitting in his wheelchair, wearing the blue and white striped bathrobe the hospital issued to its patients. When Janet Ross appeared, he smiled. Hello, Dr. Ross. Hello, Harry, she smiled back. How do you feel? It was a polite question. After years of psychiatric training, she could see clearly how he felt. Benson was nervous and threatened. There was sweat on his upper lip. His shoulders were drawn, and his hands clenched together in his lap. I feel fine, he said. Just fine. Behind Benson was Morris, pushing the wheelchair. And a cop, she said to Morris, Does he come... And a cop. She said to Morris, Does he come in with us? Before Morris could answer, Benson said lightly, He goes anywhere I go. The cop nodded and looked embarrassed. All right, she said. She opened the doors, and Morris wheeled Benson into the amphitheater, over to Ellis. Ellis came forward to shake Benson's hand. Mr. Benson, good to see you. Dr. Ellis. Morris turned him around so he was facing the amphitheater audience. Ross sat to one side and glanced at the cop, who remained up by the door, trying to look inconspicuous. Ellis stood alongside Benson, who was looking at the wall of frosted glass against which a dozen x-rays had been clipped. He seemed to realize that they were his own skull films. Ellis noticed and turned off the light behind the frosted glass. The x-rays became opaquely black. We've asked you to come here, Ellis said, to answer some questions for the doctors. He gestured to the men sitting in the semicircular tiers. They don't make you nervous, do they? Ellis asked it easily. Ross frowned. She'd attended hundreds of grand rounds in her life, and the patients were invariably asked if the doctors peering down at them made them nervous. In answer to a direct question, the patient always denied nervousness. Sure, they make me nervous, Benson said. They'd make anybody nervous. Ross suppressed a smile. Good for you, she thought. Then Benson said, What if you were a machine and I brought you in front of a bunch of computer experts who were trying to decide what was wrong with you and how to fix it? How would you feel? Ellis was plainly flustered. He ran his hands down his thinning hair and glanced at Ross. She shook her head fractionally. No, this was the wrong place to explore Benson's psychopathology. I'd be nervous too, Ellis said. Well then, Benson said, you see? Ellis swallowed. He's being deliberately irritating, Ross thought. Don't take the bait. But of course, Ellis said, I'm not a machine, am I? Ross winced. That depends, Benson said. Certain of your functions are repetitive and mechanical. From that standpoint, they are easily programmed and relatively straightforward. I think Ross said, standing up, that we might take questions from those present now. Ellis clearly didn't like that, but he was silent, and Benson mercifully was quiet. She looked up at the audience, and after a moment, a man in the back raised his hand and said, "Mr. Benson, can you tell us more about the smells you have before your blackouts?" "Not really," Benson said. "They're strange, is all. They smell terrible, but they don't smell like anything. If you get what I mean. I mean, you can't identify the odor. Memory tapes cycle through blankly. Can you give us an approximation of the odor? Maybe pig shit and turpentine?" Another hand in the audience went up. "Mr. Benson, these blackouts have been getting more frequent. Have they also been getting longer?" "Yes," Benson said. "There's several hours now." "How do you feel when you recover from a blackout?" "Sick to my stomach." "Can you be more specific? Sometimes I vomit. Is that specific enough?" Ross frowned. She could see that Benson was becoming angry. Are there any other questions?" she asked, hoping that there would not be. She looked up at the audience. There was a long silence. "Well then," Ellis said, "perhaps we can go on to discuss the details of a stage 3 surgery. Mr. Benson knows all this, so he can stay or leave, whichever he prefers." Ross didn't approve. Ellis was showing off the surgeon's instinct for demonstrating to everyone that his patient didn't mind being cut and mutilated. It was unfair to ask, to dare Benson to stay in the room. "I'll stay," Benson said. "Fine," Ellis said. He went to the blackboard and drew a brain schematically. "Now," he said, "our understanding of the disease process is that a portion of the brain is damaged in epilepsy, and a scar forms. It's like a scar in other body organs. Lots of fibrous tissue, lots of contraction and distortion, and it becomes for abnormal electrical discharges. We see spreading waves moving outward from the focus, like ripples from a rock in a pond." Ellis drew a point on the brain, then sketched concentric circles. These electrical ripples produce a seizure in some parts of the brain. The discharge focus produces a shaking fit, frothing at the mouth, and so on. In other parts, there are other effects. If the focus is in the temporal lobe, as in Mr. Benson's case, you get what is called psychomotor epilepsy, convulsions of thought, not of body, strange thoughts, and frequently violent behavior, preceded by a characteristic aura, which is often an odor. Benson was watching, listening, and nodding. "Now then," Ellis said, "we know from the work of many researchers that it is possible to abort a seizure by delivering an electrical shock to the correct position of the brain substance. These seizures begin slowly. There are a few seconds, sometimes as much as half a minute, before the seizure takes effect. A shock at that moment prevents the seizure." He drew a large X through the concentric circles. He then drew a new brain and a head around it and a neck. "We face two problems," he said. "First, what is the correct part of the brain shock? Well, we know roughly that it's in the amygdala and an anterior area of the so-called limbic system. We don't know exactly where, but we can solve the problem by implanting a number of electrodes in the brain. Mr. Benson will have 40 electrodes implanted tomorrow morning." He drew 2 lines into the brain. "Now, our second problem is, how do we know when an attack is starting? We must know when to deliver our aborting shock. Well, fortunately, the same electrodes that we use to deliver the shock can also be used to read the electrical activity of the brain. And there is a characteristic electrical pattern that precedes a seizure." Ellis paused and glanced at Benson, then up at the audience. "So we have a feedback system. The same electrodes are used to detect a new attack and to deliver the aborting shock. A computer controls the feedback mechanism." He drew a small square of the neck in a schematic figure. "Developed a computer that will monitor electrical activity of the brain, and when it sees an attack starting, it will transmit a shock to the correct brain area. The computer is about the size of a postage stamp and weighs 1/10 of an ounce. It will be implanted beneath the skin of the patient's neck." He then drew an oblong shape below the neck and attached wires to the computer square. "We'll power the computer with a Handler PPJ plutonium power pack, which will be implanted beneath the skin of the shoulder. This makes the patient completely self-sufficient. The power pack supplies energy continuously and reliably for 20 years. With with his chalk, he tapped the different parts of his diagram. That's the computer feedback loop. Brain to electrodes to computer, to power pack back to brain. A total loop without any externalized portions. He turned to Benson, who had watched the discussion with bland disinterest. Any comments, Mr. Benson? Ross groaned inwardly. Ellis was really letting him have it. It was flagrantly sadistic, even for a surgeon. No, Benson said, I have nothing to say. And he yawned. When Benson was wheeled out of the room, Ross went with him. It wasn't really necessary for her to accompany him, but she was concerned about his condition and a little guilty about the way Ellis had treated him. She said, How do you feel? I thought it was interesting, he said. In what way? Well, the discussion was entirely medical. I would have expected a more philosophical approach. We're just practical people, she said lightly, dealing with a practical problem. Benson smiled. So was Newton, he said. What's more practical than the problem of why an apple falls to the ground? Do you really see philosophical implications in all this? Benson nodded. His expression turned serious. Yes, he said, and so do you. You're just pretending that you don't. She stopped and stood in the corridor, watching as Benson was wheeled down to the elevator. Benson, Morris, and the cop waited in the corridor for the next car. Morris pushed the button repeatedly in that impatient, aggressive way of his. When the elevator arrived and they got on, Benson waved one last time and the doors closed. She was back to the amphitheater. Has been under development for 10 years, Ellis was saying. It was first started for cardiac pacemakers, where changing batteries requires minor surgery of a year or so. It's an annoyance to surgeon and patient. The atomic power pack is totally reliable and has a long lifespan. If Mr. Benson is still alive, we might have to change packs around 1990, but not before then. Janet Ross slipped back into the room just as another question was asked. How will you determine which of the 40 electrodes will prevent a seizure? We will implant them all, Ellis said, and wire up the computer, but we will not lock in any electrodes for 24 hours. One day after surgery, we'll simulate each of the electrodes by radio and determine which electrodes work best. We will lock those in by remote control. High up in the amphitheater, a familiar voice coughed and said, These technical details are interesting, but they seem to me to elude the point. Ross looked up and saw Manson speaking. Manson was nearly 75 and an emeritus professor of psychiatry who rarely came to the hospital anymore. When he did, he was usually regarded as a cranky old man, far past his prime, out of touch with modern thinking. It seems to me, Manson continued, that the patient is psychotic. That's putting it a little strongly, Ellis said. Perhaps, Manson said, but at the very least, he has a severe personality disorder. All this confusion about men and machines is worrisome to me. The personality disorder is part of his disease, Ellis said. In a recent review, Harley and co-workers at Yale reported that 50% of temporal lobe epileptics had an accompanying personality disorder, which was independent of seizure activity per se. Quite so, Manson said, in a voice that had the slightest edge of impatience to it. It is part of his disease, independent of seizures. But will your procedure cure it? Janet Ross found herself quietly pleased. Manson was reaching exactly at her own conclusions. No, Ellis said. Probably not. In other words, the operation will stop his seizures, but it won't stop his delusions. No, Ellis repeated, probably not. If I may make a small speech, Manson said, frowning down from the top row. This kind of thinking is what I fear most from the NPS. I don't mean to single you out particularly. It's a general problem of the medical profession. For example, if we get a suicide attempt or a suicide gesture by drug overdose in the emergency ward, or approaches to pump the patient's stomach, give him a lecture, and send him home. That's a treatment, but it's hardly a cure. The patient will be back sooner or later. Stomach pumping doesn't treat depression. It only treats a drug overdose. I see what you're saying, but I'd also remind you that you of the hospital's experience with Mr. L. Do you recall these cases? I don't think Mr. L applies here, Ellis said, but his voice was stiff and exasperated. I'm not so sure, Mason said. Several puzzled faces in the amphitheater were turned toward him. He explained, Mr. L was a famous case here a few years ago. He was a 39-year-old man with bilateral end-stage kidney disease. chronic glomerular nephritis. He was considered a candidate for renal transplant because our facilities for transplantation are limited. Our hospital review board selects patients. The psychiatrist on that board strongly opposed Mr. L as a transplantation candidate because he was psychotic. He believed that the sun ruled the earth and he refused to go outside during the daylight hours. We felt he was too unstable to benefit from kidney surgery, but he ultimately received the operation. 6 months later, he committed suicide. That's a tragedy, but the real question is, couldn't someone else have benefited more from the thousands of dollars and many hours of specialized effort that went into the transplant? Ellis paced back and forth, the foot off of his bad legs, scraping slightly across the floor. Ross knew it meant he was feeling threatened, under attack. Normally, Ellis was careful to minimize his disability, concealing it, so that the limp was noticeable only to a trained eye. But if he was tired or angry or threatened, the flaw appeared. It was almost as if he unconsciously wanted sympathy. Don't attack me, I'm a cripple. Consciously, of course, he was not aware of it. I understand your objection, Ellis said. In terms you present it, your argument is unanswerable, but I would like to consider the problem from a somewhat different viewpoint. It is perfectly true that Benson is disturbed and that our operation probably won't change that. But what happens if we don't operate on him? Are we doing him a favor? I don't think so. We know that his seizures are life-threatening. To himself, to others, his seizures have already gotten him into trouble with the law, and his seizures are getting worse. The operation will prevent seizures, and we think that that is an important benefit to the patient. High up, Manson gave a little shrug. Janet Ross knew the gesture. It signaled irreconcilable difference or impasse. Well then, Ella said, are there any other questions? There were no other questions.